My honor today to introduce you to our highly respected guest, but before I do that, I have a few announcements to make. The University of New Mexico Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice is honored to host this event, which features our esteemed guest lecturer, Nana Osi Kofi, to be followed by a critical conversation. We would like to acknowledge the support that the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice has received from the following organizations to make this event possible: the Teaching Allocation Grant TAG, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Center for Health Policy, the Division of Equity and Inclusion, and the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences. We would also like to acknowledge Dr. Nancy Lopez, Director and co-founder of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. She played a key role in making this event possible and regrets she cannot be present, as she is presenting on linking the silos of racial equity work at Virginia Tech today. I am happy to officially announce that the Race and Social Justice Interdisciplinary Graduate Certificate was approved by the Board of Regents and will be available to students in the fall. Woo! We've been waiting. Please visit the website race.nm.edu, which will be available by late summer, fall 2016. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today. Nana Osi Kofi is the Director of Difference, Power, and Discrimination Program and an Associate Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State University. She holds an MA in Applied Women's Studies and a PhD in Education from Claremont Graduate University. Prior to her appointment at OSU, she was an Associate Professor and Director of the Social Justice Studies Graduate Certificate Program in the School of Education at Iowa State University. Her scholarship focuses on critical and feminist social theories and pedagogies, social justice studies, the politics of American higher education, visual cultural studies, and arts-based inquiry. Journals in which her work has appeared include Discourse Studies in the Cultural Politics of Education, Feminist Formation, the Review of Higher Education, Equity and Excellence in Education, Latino Studies, Latino Studies, and the Review of Education, Pedagogy, and Critical Cultural Studies. Today, her lecture entitled #FightRacism, Educating for Social Justice will address questions that I am sure we have all faced regarding current social issues, how social conditions differ across disciplines and fields of study, how demographic makeups of classroom inform the ways in which issues such as power, privilege, and oppression are discussed, and the roles of instructors as embodied text in addressing current social conditions. Please join us again tomorrow for a Q&A with Dr. Osi Kofi from 10 to 11:30 in the Sociology Building. It's on the first floor in the Sociology Commons. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming our esteemed guest, Dr. Osi Kofi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to, a tech question. Is it all right if I move this mic? Okay. Thank you. All right. Good to see everybody out here on a Thursday afternoon. So I want to begin by first thanking the Institute Advisory Board for inviting me here today, and I'm very honored and excited to be here, especially so soon after the approval of the certificate. That's really very, very exciting. And I especially want to thank Nancy Lopez and Tyson Marsh for all the work that they did to make this possible. I'm getting a little feedback? Okay, I'll move away from that. I also want to thank Kaylee Hubbard, who did the logistics for my visit as well, because there's a lot that goes into these types of things. So you heard a little bit about who I am and what I do through this very generous introduction. What I would like to do in addition to that is to say a little bit about how I situate myself in relation to race. And So as someone who is a criticalist, who does race, gender, and sexuality work, who works with race and ethnicity, positionality matters, right? And so it's, to me, very important to understand how one is located in relation to race because of the ways in which it shapes how I'm heard, how I'm understood, the ways in which one makes meaning, right, of the context and the environment that one is in. So for me, I grew up in a Swedish Ghanaian family. My mother's side of the family is Swedish. My father's side is from Ghana. And what that meant was that I had a sense of what race as a floating signifier was very, very early on. And so race as a floating signifier is from Stuart Hall's work. And of course, as a child, I didn't know that theoretical term or what that was about, but I understood it through an embodied experience, right? So at 5 years old, living in Kumasi in Ghana, one of the things that I would hear from kids as they were in a teasing way was brony, which means white person. And it also means outsider in many ways, right? Somebody who doesn't belong. And so fast forward 4 years after that, we moved to Sweden. And at that time, so this was about late 70s. And at that time, one of the most popular television shows on Swedish television was Roots. And any of you familiar with Roots, Alex Haley's work, right? Okay, so it goes back to slavery. And so what I would hear coming off the bus from school or things like that was Kunta Kinte, right? Kunta Kinte. So Kunta Kinte, for those of you who are not familiar with Roots, is the main character that the work starts with, who in, I think it's 1767, is captured in Gambia and then brought to Maryland, right? So what was interesting for me with this was that I knew that there was a contradiction, right? So in one space I was considered white, in another space I was considered black, but I was one person, right? So that's what I mean when I talk about this as a very an experience that happened early on that sensitized me, I would say, to race and how it functions as a floating signifier. And what I really like, what I'm partial to, I guess, sort of in the way of talking about it, is to talk about it as racialization. And I think that I'm partial to racialization because of the ways in which it reminds us that race is a social construction. But of course, when I talk about race as a social construction, we understand that there are very, very real material consequences, right, of that social construction. So I'm not in any way suggesting that that is void in that analysis. But there's a particular definition or way of talking about racialization that I really appreciate. And this is Jill Olumidu's work. She's a black scholar out of the UK. And so what she says here is that the language of racialization places the burden of race thinking at the feet of the race thinker. And so I like that because we can also think about it as placing it at the feet of the institution, at the feet of society, right? At the feet of social structures as well. So I hope that this gives you sort of a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from as we get deeper into this work. And what I want to focus on today is the graduate certificate and talk a little bit about why I think it matters and the potential that it can play in the struggle against racism. So one of the things that I did as I was looking at the materials was to look at the goals of the certificate. And so one of the goals of the certificate is addressing pressing concerns regarding racial inequities and social justice in the 21st century. And so, to me, in order to do this, it means that we need to understand the current context, right? That's a place where we need to begin with this work. So what What do we think of when we think of racial inequities today? So what I want to do with this as a way of starting us off is I want to share a set of images that attempt to speak to this. And my question to you as you're watching those is, what are these images telling us? What do you see? And also, what do you feel as you watch these? Okay? I'd like to ask you at this point to turn to the person next to you and just take a couple of minutes to talk about how are you making meaning of these images? What is it that you see? What are these images telling you? What do you feel? Just take a couple of minutes.
Searched every floor of this building for water. Are you okay?
Yeah.
I have water.
Huh?
I have one in my bag, but I've been drinking out of it.
It's fine.
Do you want me to bring it up?
No, it's fine. It's all right. Yeah. All right. Does anybody want to share what they talked about? Just a couple of words. Not all at once. Sure, please.
I mean, I think it really shows how race still matters at this point. I'm also from Dallas, so thinking we think that race doesn't matter, but once it's here, in a way, and it really does matter.
Okay, so race still matters. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, please.
Drawing on that,
Mhm.
I'm first generation American. My parents are from El Salvador, and me growing up within that, not necessarily culture. I was raised in the American culture. I don't know anything about that side or anything about that. So growing up as an American, with parents who told me, don't tell people who you are because they were oppressed and they grew up where Spanish was their first language, English was not their first language, and in the school system it wasn't allowed. And if you knew Spanish, you were completely an outsider. So just growing up with that, you know, it's real moving to see that these things are still happening within our society, but that change is coming. And it's great to see that change is coming.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, please.
What stood out to me was the Native American girl with the police officer applied with the extermination.
Yeah.
And it's like, it still exists. Like, they still want to exterminate the Native American. Doing research on sterilization, and that's what, you know, women are still doing. It's like the first thing they want to do is offer, remove the womb. Sterilization, so it's a form of genocide towards Native Americans.
So the ways in which.
And then also what I see too is like, it's all people of color. And then you see one group of white women, and and it's about feminism. But even at that, feminism between white women and black women and Native women is all different. They all have different struggles.
Yeah, and I think those women were actually Asian American women. Yeah. Yeah, no. But I think, I mean, the key point on these are still things that are going on, right? Yeah. Let's take one or two more. How's the back of the room doing? Yes, please.
I think these pictures show people that wanted to be recognized as humans and wanted their rights as humans to be respected instead of being looked at as other or not normal or different or stuff like that. It's just showing people that want to be respected as just regular people, everyday people, not just others.
Wanting to be recognized as human and not as the other. Yeah. One more. Anything over on this side? Yes, please.
I just noticed through the pictures that they're all minorities and they're all segregated in their own way, and like the Red Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Each minority has this issue within their culture, within their race, and that alone is a form of racism, because even though they face this issue, they could like join together for like a minorities battling something, but because lost my train of thought, but yes, let's go in that direction.
Okay, let's look at that, and let's come back to that as sort of thinking about what, sort of how we understand racism and the relationship of how power informs what we think of as racism. So I did this with my students earlier this week, and these are some of the terms that they came up with, or this is what I put together in a Wordle that speaks to what they identified, which are some of the things that you also mentioned here. And I think that part of what we see with this is that these issues don't happen in isolation. So if you look at the images, there are issues around environmental justice, right? There are issues around sexuality. There are issues around labor. There are issues around gender. And so there are all these ways, right, in which these issues are both informed by racism and shaped by racism, right? So those relationships there. Another way to think about or to engage with the current context is to consider racial injustice by the numbers, if you will. And sometimes that, I find, can be very powerful because we're enamored with numbers in our culture, right, in our society. But it's also, it really speaks to the way in which this is not about some sort of a isolated or affective reality, and not about perception. This is about real lives, right, and real consequences. And so I know that with the certificate, one of the things that you're really emphasizes is interdisciplinarity. And so I just picked some data points across different contexts, and there are many more where those came from, but many of you are probably familiar with some of these. And I thought we would start in higher education. So 79% of full-time faculty at degree-granting institutions are white. Less than 1% American Indian, Alaska Native. When charged with a crime, a black male is 6 times more likely to go to jail than a white male. Compared to whites, Latinos are 40% more likely to die from cervical cancer. Asian American women have the highest suicide rate of all women over 65 in the United States. Black children are 3 times more likely than white children to be suspended in school. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are close to 6 times more likely than whites living in Hawaii to die from diabetes. Black college graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed as college graduates overall. I'm going to show you one more piece because I think this one is incredibly powerful. This is wealth by race, ethnicity. This is from the Pew Research Center. They were looking at shifts from 2007 to 2013. It's median net worth of households in 2013 dollars. I didn't forget any zeros on these. So if you look at the numbers, we're looking at 2013. Median net worth of households in 2013 dollars. White families, $141,900. Black families, $11,000. Hispanic, $13,700. So that's the way in which history, right, and the opportunity to accumulate wealth shapes the present. Now, if we look at the media, popular culture, dominant perspectives, we hear something very different a lot of times. These are all newspaper clippings, headings. I didn't make these up. So it's a dominant message that says that we're post-racial, right? That it's about individuals and that it's about maximizing opportunity. And so once we move into the realm of it only being about individuals, then racism is also individual, right? So it's about the bad apple. So what I want to really sort of spend most of the time on today is to think about what it means for us as educators to provide a different frame, right? A different way for our students to come to understand the current context and to, from that, have the ability to engage in change, coming from a place of belief and an understanding of the need for social change, all right? And so, again, going back to this certificate, which I'm really excited about, what I did was look at one of the learning outcomes that I want to use as a jumping off point for this. So students will illustrate and interpret the historical, political, social, psychological, cultural, and or economic dimensions of race, racialization, difference in power, integrating these into an interdisciplinary perspective, right? And what I want to say about this is, so in talking about students, I'm not only talking about students because I'm well aware that when we look at demographics, you know, student diversity has far outpaced faculty diversity. And so we certainly find ourselves in situations where students, because of their experiences, have a much more sophisticated analysis than faculty at times. And so this is really about broad learning that is not just about students. And I would say that it's also about thinking of ourselves all as educators in different settings and sort of our ability to, we all have the potential to provide a different kind of education in different settings. Now, this to me is also about a responsibility to provide a different type of education in institutional spaces that I would say are very, very resistant to learning when it comes to racial injustice, okay? And I think a really good example of that is what we've seen with speak outs around the country. And so the ways in which institutions have responded are, you've got lots of committees, there's marketing, there are training programs, all these different ways in which institutions want to demonstrate that they are responsive and that they're responding efficiently and quickly to these things. But for a lot of places, when you look at what is actually being done, at the most basic level, I would say we find a checkbox approach, and sort of the best that we can hope for, what we see, sort of the best sort of possible outcome has to do with attitudinal changes. Right, so a lot of the initiatives and the work is informed by seeking to foster attitudinal changes. And not that there's anything wrong with attitudinal changes, but where is the focus on material changes, right, on structural changes, on policies, on practices? We don't see that. So what do we do to shift this? What do we do in terms of realizing a learning outcome and a goal such as this? So I'm generally not big on the idea of frameworks or checklists with this kind of work, because I think that every context, every environment is specific so how we do this work around race is specific to that environment, to that context, to that history, to that geography. And when we use frameworks and checklists or ways of thinking about this, a lot of times it can become sort of an advice column approach to this idea that do these 10 things and then we're set. Right? So having said that, despite that, I guess what I've done my homework in terms of speaking to you around these things today. So I am going to offer a framework, if you will, but I want to position this as suggesting that here are some things that I think we should think about, right, as we try to model and practice, put this into practice as educators, right? And so at minimum, here are some things that I think that we should be thinking about. And I want to try and frame this in ways that foster questions, right? So for those of you that read a lot of Paulo Freire, you know that one of the things that Freire talks about is this idea of our obsession with answers. And so I want to try and model the idea that we open ourselves up to more questions. So what I want to talk about are these 4 areas. What it means to know ourselves as instructors, knowing our students, how we teach, and what it is that we teach. And I'm going to start with this idea of instructor and knowing ourselves. And what I want to talk about is the idea of instructor as embodied text. And there's a quote from Tina Kazan that I really like, so I'm going to go ahead and start with that. What she says is that we cannot teach effectively without theorizing the body and difference, without considering our own assumptions about our bodies and our teaching, right? So what does that mean to know myself? What does it mean to know ourselves as instructors? How do our identities shape our teaching? What are the implications of how we show up in the classroom as embodied text?
Story, you couldn't rely on not any volume to do our own research. We were responsible for it ourselves.
Okay, so part of this, I mean, as you're hearing these 2, has to do with the fact that this is the assumption, or this is sort of the stereotype that we have in our mind of what a professor is supposed to look like. Right, what an academic is supposed to look like. So I want to share with you as part of this, thank you, part of Paul Gorski's work, and this is Paul talking about what it means to always be read as belonging, right? To always be the unquestioned expert, to always be seen as the host, right? Never the guest. So the ultimate luxury of whiteness was to see myself as neutral and thus excuse myself from any responsibility of addressing racial issues. Being was easier that way. And in this piece, he then goes on to talk about doing the work. And so he says, I had to immerse myself in a systemic process of examining how my experience as a white person informed my teaching, as well as the lenses through which I saw my students. So I want to transition here to talk about students and this idea of knowing our students and the importance of that. So while institutions are becoming more diverse, a lot of times I think just the ways in which we have a particular image in our mind when it comes to faculty, we also have a particular image in our mind when we think of students, and it's an image that no longer aligns with reality, and if it still does, it certainly won't as we go forward looking at demographics, right, and looking at data. And so I want to focus here, most of this, on the importance of knowing and understanding students of color and the experiences of students of color. And the reason for that has to do with what I talked about before, right, the ways in which the diversity that we have in institutions, and we claim diversity, is diversity on the backs of students, right? Because the faculty diversity has not changed very much in a very, very long time, right? So let me offer you just the demographic piece, right? It's 2050, and as a reminder, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this and have seen this. This is all U.S. Census Bureau language, so it's rather interesting, right, in terms of the way that this is framed. But so by 2050, members of any race other than non-Hispanic, single-race whites will make up 54% of the population. And this is what this looks like for higher education. So when we look at enrollment by race, ethnicity, and where the growth will be, right? So you can see these numbers here where we're looking at 25% black students, 42% Hispanic. These large numbers. All right. So to illustrate the importance of knowing and understanding experiences of students of color, what I want to share with you is part of a campaign that some of you might have seen last year, maybe even, might even have started a little bit the year before. So I also want to include here talking a little bit about student resistance, right? Because that's another piece of knowing students. And so I just want to share a couple of quotes with you. This is from D'Angelo and Sensoy, and if you're in the classroom, you've probably heard some of these things. I accept people for who they are. I always treat everyone the same. Our generation is more open-minded. I have friends of all races, and we're all fine with each other. I've been discriminated against, so I don't have any privilege. I see people as individuals. I don't think race and gender make any difference as long as you work hard, right? So let me sort of remind you of where we're at. So we've looked at faculty, looked at students, and I want to transition here to thinking about pedagogy and content. And offer some student voices around that. And I hope that what you're seeing, of course, is that there's lots of overlap in this, right, in the way that these things work in relation to one another. What I'm going to share with you are student voices. They're undergraduate students at a small liberal arts institution in Minnesota. And even though it's a different institutional type, right, what we see across institutional types when it comes to the experiences of students of color in the classroom is very much consistent with what you will hear here. Yeah. Let's see. Try that.
When a professor notices that I am the only student of color, I don't like to be pinpoint. I don't want to be that one to always be like targeted, like, oh, well, you'll have the answer because you're the only one who is a student of color in this class. So that's one thing that I think alienates me, because I always feel like every time I go into class, I'm going to have this long thing to say, or I don't know, speak for kind of something that we talked about a little earlier. Speak for my entire race, or speak from, like someone. I'm always going to be speaking for, African American women. That's something that I don't really like so much. So
I think also, just going off of what Bree just said, it's kind of distracting as a student. I know, like last semester, there was the whole Black Lives Matter movement was very prominent, I guess. There was a lot going on, and every time I came into a classroom and somehow this discussion came up about Black Lives Matter, as a just felt like that basically just ruined my whole day. I wouldn't be able to learn anything else for the rest of the day. And I just think it's really distracting academically to have to focus on something else in the classroom. That, I mean, it's good to talk about it, but I guess from my perspective, it puts a lot of pressure on me, and I have to talk about something in the first place that's affecting me personally. That sometimes I probably don't even want to talk about that in class, but we have to. So.
I think one thing that would make me feel alienated is not being able to speak from where I actually come from. So certain topics in the class we're talking about, I have no idea what they're talking about. Yes, I'm willing to sit there and learn, but if I am to participate, I would like for my professors to maybe consider like where I come from and maybe be a little bit more open instead of just strict onto the topic we're talking about. Maybe just listen to me bring my perspective, but from where I come from, even though it's not specifically exactly what we're talking about, that would be able to make me contribute to the class instead of just sitting there feeling like we're talking about these two topics or this topic and I have no idea. I'm just going to sit here and learn and lose participation points. I don't get anything. I don't speak because I don't know. Just understanding that we have people from different places who might not look so until they speak, but just understanding that I can participate, but maybe if I told you what it was like where I'm from, it shows you get interested in where I come from.
This isn't really like classroom related, but more curriculum and study stuff related. It would be nice if we could, our entire lives we've been taught the white male history of people who have helped develop this country and like have done all these things to further the sciences or the histories, but it'd be nice to have once in a while shape a curriculum and have thrown a book in there of someone who is female or someone who comes from a culturally underrepresented person in that subject that I'm studying, because it would mean a lot to have someone who comes from a similar background as me and to see how they have furthered and improved the subject that I'm studying. And it's not, so we come in and there's a barrier like in the classroom and you read all these things like old white guys, and it's nice to shake up the curriculum a little bit. I know that you guys have been using it for a long time and sometimes it will be hard to stick away from it to change it because it's the way it's been taught for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's okay to try something new because the faces of the students are changing and it's important that when we go into society, we feel that someone who studied the same subject that we are studying made an improvement in there and that if they were able to do that, then I can do it too. And to learn that in college is extremely important.
Yeah, funny thing is like a cousin of mine who went to grad school, he was just like, I'm tired of learning about dead white people. So, I know that sounds kind of harsh, but yeah, I can agree with what Jorely said. That yeah, changing up the curriculum is a good thing. Just to it also reinforces that people of color, are educated too. Just because like we are kind of like most of us are first generation college students, and it just helps reinforce the idea that we can also achieve and be successful as the other students here. And another thing I would like to add too is that what I think is a sticking point is that it's just how professors handle the situation when those type of issues come up, like the Black Lives Matter from last semester. You guys all know about a couple years ago with the protests, and also like situations with these apps that the students use on their phones. So like just having proper training on this, so like more multicultural training for the professors and more like being able to fund you as professors to go to more conferences to learn about these things and learn how to handle these situations, because I think that's really important. That's a key thing on how to connect with a student of color, is just how to handle it, and that's my say on it.
So a colleague of mine, Chris Linder, she does work on study of higher ed, has done research on students of color in the classroom, and some of the things that she found you'll find consistent with what you just heard here. I wanted to share just some of her work with you. One of the things that students talked about was about being disappointed with a stated commitment to social justice. So this is where they came into programs and courses where there was a stated commitment around issues of social justice, racial justice, and they found themselves disappointed because there was a sense that that commitment was not realized. The other things that they talked about was failure to intervene. And this is a very common one. So this failure of faculty to intervene in the classroom when these conversations, difficult conversations, if you will, conversations around race are engaged and something happens that is an inappropriate comment is made or, oh, thank you, yeah, or something happens between students around that conversation. Another piece they talked about was lack of depth. And so this, I think, can be aligned with the disappointment piece of that there was not sufficient depth when issues like race, class, gender, and sexuality were dealt with. And then finally, the piece that I think you heard here too was this idea of tokenization, right? Being that the one and only in the classroom being asked to speak on behalf of. What she did in her research, though, was she also asked students, how do we fix this? Or what are some of the ways in which we can work to change these things? Some of the things they said were, one was recognize the role of emotion, right? So recognize that emotion is part of these conversations, acknowledge that and engage that head on. And also related to that, discussing power dynamics openly. So not just pretending that they aren't there. So let's talk about power, right? Let's talk about how it works in the space that we're in and as we're having these kinds of conversations. Facilitating hard conversations, I think that aligns well with what's been previously said. And what they said specifically here that I want to mention is not making it the responsibility of students of color, right? So in terms of where that conversation goes. Setting up group norms. So starting out with a very clear understanding of how we're going to interact with one another, how we're going to engage these conversations. And then the last piece that they talked about was feeling validated, and feeling validated in a one-on-one environment and setting with faculty. So really about being seen and being heard, right? A response and a challenge to a lot of times what is erasure in different ways. So some of the questions that we might ask then in relation to how we teach is how power is distributed in our classrooms. What interests are served by our pedagogical practices? What does our pedagogy say about our worldviews? Okay. So let me say a little bit, as we move to close here, on course content. And keep in mind, because we're talking about race and social justice, that it's very easy to teach about race without engaging power. Or it happens frequently, maybe I should say, right? So where race just becomes a variable, right? We want to do something very different than that. So we always have to engage power. I think interdisciplinarity is very important, and that's something that you're emphasizing in your graduate certificate program, right? Because we need, it's important to have multiple disciplines, right, and fields of study inform the ways in which we come to understand racial inequities and have the opportunity to do work to address those types of issues. But what I really want to emphasize and what I want to talk about is this idea of thinking about how our citational politics translate into our selection of course content. And the reason I put these two things together, right, is because when we think about our citational politics, right, so who we're citing, right, in our work, and when we think about course selection, the question that we're really answering through that process is whose knowledges matter, what knowledges are worth knowing. And I use the plural, right? They're very, very intentionally, very purposefully. That's what we're deciding as we're engaged in those two practices. And so I think that that is a key piece when we think about course content. And I want to offer a way of thinking about this. There's a scholar named Monisha Dasgupta, and part of what she talks about is this idea of making a distinction between space taking and space making. And what she talks about is space taking as being about a politics of accommodation, while space making is something that we struggle for because it is about creating social transformation. And so one way to think about that when we think about course content is really can be the difference between an additive approach, right, and a holistic approach in relation to the production of knowledge. So where we started with this, bringing you back. So we started with addressing pressing concerns regarding racial inequities and social justice in the 21st century. And what I want to do is tie this back again to one of what I see as a key learning outcome, the certificate. And that's that students will be aware of opportunities to go from theory to practice. I want to suggest that that is absolutely key. And I'm going to cite myself here. I don't do that a lot, but so what I want to say here is that initiatives such as these, right, they must be grounded in a rationale that is not simply about having a conversation, but also about empowering and educating those involved to enact change in higher education, right? That is where our focus has to be. And for me, one of the ways in which I think about this and what I've been inspired by for a long time is the late work of Manning Marable. One thing Manning Marable talked about was struggling where you are, right? And so a lot of times when I work with students, they say, but I'm only one person, or this is so overwhelming, what can I do? And so to me, when Marable talks about struggling where you are, it's about asking ourselves the question what it means to put social justice into practice wherever we find ourselves, right? It could be right here, it could be with a friend, it could be at home, it could be in our community, it could be within the institution, right? So on and so forth. And the last piece that I want to say with this is something that a colleague of mine, Kelly Mack, who's with the American Association of Colleges and Universities, shared a couple of days ago that I made a strong impression on me. And she talked about this idea as we do this work, she said, it's not about us. She's like, it's not about us, okay? And what she meant by that is, you know, the fact that I can stand before you today and talk about this, give this lecture, is a result of struggle and a lot of work that was done long before, right, I came to this place. So that's work long before my time that makes my presence here possible and makes this work possible. And so in the same way, right, our work hopefully creates a different future for those that come. So it's not about us, right? It's one way of thinking about how we do this work and framing the ways in which we do this work. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. No, you can moderate on.
Okay. Do you have any questions for our speaker today?
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and visiting and sharing this your presentation. I was curious how many institutions like this are popping up around our country. Maybe.
In terms of institutions, say more.
So institutions on social justice, racism issues, things
Oh.
like that. To where, because you spoke a few times specifically talking about certificates.
Right.
And so are there more opportunities being made available for students to earn certificates like that so they can enact change?
Right, right.
And become from an authority point having something like that.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, I think it still happens in pockets, right? So we had, I developed a program at Iowa State. You have a program now. There are programs that are tied to discipline. So I think part of what you're doing here that is powerful is the interdisciplinary nature of it. So because we see certificate programs in social work, for example, places like that. I think in some ways, you know, certificates are both sort of a double-edged sword in a way because it, you know, it allows us to do the work and it places a focus on pieces that are missing in other places within the institution, but it also then, it is in some ways an add-on to that. Or I think that for it to work effectively, we still have to focus on making sure that this work becomes or moves to the center of disciplines, right, and moves to the center of fields of study so that it doesn't remain sort of at the margins or as an add-on to in sort of thinking about the larger work. Yeah.
Other questions?
Mhm.
and what, like, how you address racism within your area of being in
Well, I mean, I think for me, that's why I do the work that I do, right? And there are lots of ways to do the work. There are lots of ways to struggle to work against racism. And so to me, and for me, teaching, right, is one of the most powerful ways that I can do that, and sort of make that my contribution with that. Also, the writing that I do and the scholarship that I do is about helping us think about these things in different ways, helping us engage in new perspectives, new ways of thinking. I do believe in the power of shifting consciousness. That cannot be divorced from actually doing work in communities and being on the ground, if you will. But I do believe that has an important place. There, then there, yeah. Sorry, I'm taking over your role.
sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So sometimes some of the students kind of see extra class in intercultural communication, and sometimes they're coming with this idea that after taking this class, I have been known in the zone. So sometimes when I think about, for instance, having a certificate in race and social justice, somebody might check the course like this and say, after taking this course, I am finally in the known zone, not like the others. How would you help, for instance, someone like me, teaching some of these areas, also think about what can my class really give me or other instructors to help students not see this as the end. This is not, that you not become cold by taking this class only, but this is like a process what you've begun. What can my class be help us think through this?
Hard question. That is a tough question. I think that one of the ways, and I certainly don't feel like I have the whole answer to that, it's sort of an ongoing process, right? But one of the ways is by highlighting what we don't know, right? And coming back to presenting material, engaging material in a way that we actually come to recognize, or that one comes to recognize how little we know, and the need to continue to learn and to sort of have a humility, right, in learning. You make me think of Hans Rosling has something called the Ignorance Project. It's an international project, and the reason that he started it was because he does a lot of work in public health, and he came to realize that he works a lot with medical students, that they didn't understand the shifts that have happened in the world. And so the views of these medical students when it comes to the world, when we think about sort of literacy and vaccines and health and girls' education, those types of things, were stuck in the 1950s. And so he goes around the world now and does these ignorance projects where he asks people about the perceptions of this and to have a sense of, and so then it allows him to present the data. And it's very eye-opening, I think, for those who are able to participate in something like that, to see that we have moved in different ways, we have shifted. And so being able to recognize, and I think there's an openness to learning more. Yeah. There was some, yeah.
How do you see this translating from the college classroom to the street? Because for me, I'm interested in raising awareness and education, et cetera. But I'm also interested in seeing a wider cultural change. And there seems to be this, you mentioned that it can't be divorced from community involvement, et cetera. And there seems to be a disconnect between what goes on in higher education and what goes on in the larger communities. How do you see that translating?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is both bringing community to institutions and having people in institutions go out and work with communities. I think it's a delicate relationship in that the ways in which institutions and academia typically approach communities has been in very, very paternalistic ways, right? In very colonizing ways, and sort of the experts that we're going to show you how to do this and how this works. And so coming with an attitude and a perspective of being there to learn and being invited to participate, being invited to engage in that work, I think are really, really important pieces. Now, the other piece I'll say with that is obviously part of what contributes to a hindrance of these types of relationships in this work has to do with what we value in the academy, right? And the ways in which faculty are evaluated, what counts, what matters. And so I think that that's work that we can do on the inside, if you will, so that things like scholarship of engagement is just as valuable as, I published an article in a top tier journal, sort of whatever that means. So that's a piece that can happen on this end. But it's a relationship, I think, that has to be based on, again, sort of that humility piece, but based on invitation and allowing that it's, communities take the lead, right? It's not about going in and telling people how to do things and what to do. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sean, and to speak on this gentleman's note about community action, I'm actually part of a group called Truth to Power and am sorry to be really quickly solicitous, but we are talking about interethnic conversations, gender, a lot of the same issues that are brought up by Black Lives Matter, which a lot of folks think is just very militant, black focused, which very much is, but also talks about cis roles, gay roles, trans roles, gender roles as well. So I think that's unfortunate that so much of the Black Lives Matter focus, or what the media portrays it as, is very, very narrow focus, when in fact, what they're originally trying to do was very broad, was reaching out to a lot of different segments. So if anyone wants to talk about Truth to Power NM afterwards, I'd be happy to, and I'm sorry to interrupt for that. I did have a question though. What was interesting to me, the one part that didn't really fit, that I have a question about in your presentation, was the students who were speaking about tokenization, and I'm not being sarcastic here at all, but I can't fit their concerns with tokenization and sort of that pressure to feel like they're speaking for their entire ethnic group, with then also the same concern of please understand my history, please understand my ethnicity, my specialness, my individuality. And I'm sorry that, to me, there's almost like a slight contradiction there. And not that I don't want to be broad-minded, not that I don't want to see each student as an individual. I'm mixed similarly to you, and so I've very interestingly in my life had that fly-on-the-wall experience, where people will start talking about black people right in front of me, thinking that I'm Puerto Rican, and and throw an N-bomb out there, and I'm like, dude, what are you doing? Like, I'm black, I'll kick your ass. But is there how as a professor could I address both those concerns? Address your ethnic specialness and your celebration of that, which is again what my group wanted to do, Truth to Power. Do the multicultural thing, even though the 90s and coming into the millennium, it was a very good conservative push saying now that multiculturalism is just being divisive. I completely disagree. But then also, how do I address that student who's like, well, now you're turning to me to answer for my group. So it's like, well, which one? It's almost like walking on eggshells at the same time trying to speak about these ethnic concerns, speak about our experience.
Sure. So I don't think there's a contradiction, and there's lots of different ways to answer that, but I think I'll touch on a couple of pieces that, one is that it's not the student's job, it's your job as an instructor. It's not their job to educate, right, around those issues. So I think, for example, if we're teaching history, and so because, you mentioned history, so it's, as an instructor, it's my responsibility then to teach a history that is truly representative of the United States. It's not the responsibility of the student to have to bring that to the classroom. So I think that's one piece. I think the other piece around the issue that you raise is that it is, being, so as that student of color in the classroom, making a comment or having an opinion, that's a place where that's that student as an individual, not as well, you know, Jane said this, and so therefore, you know, all X people believe this or this way. So I mean, I think as instructors, we have a significant responsibility around avoiding both of those pieces that you mentioned. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to add something to
Sure.
this comment. You know, something the young lady said also struck me as well. And that is, and you're right, it is the role of the instructor, the lecturer, to be able to it's not the role of the student. But I think the instructor should also be grounded in knowledge to understand that what has happened with, say, for example, the African American population, is that folks during the 50s and 60s took their eyes off the prize. Everything became about civil rights rather than human rights. And so this whole notion of the United States pushing this notion of integration rather than dealing with power movement that talk about subordination all over the globe and oppression all at many levels, people push that aside. So students today don't have an understanding of those great levels of oppression and things because they've been accommodated into thinking that everyone should be integrated right away and everything's going to be okay, rather than realizing that still the education system, which is doing exactly what it's been designed to do for 500 years, is still maintain that power and privilege, you know, without dealing with issues of subordination. And so the student voice today are really coming to an understanding of subordination on all its levels in terms of racism, ageism, genderism, ableism, language issues, and they're standing forth and speaking about it in a united way. And so that's what instructors have to get across to students, I think, as well.
Excellent point, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, so I'm thinking back to what you were sharing. So I heard, you know, the one comment that, oh, well, they're just reinscribing racism because there are these separate groups that are, you know, doing separate things. And I, you know, as you're fighting racism, and I think, so here we are as instructors, we have to already assume that our students don't get it, in addition to being in departments with faculty who don't get it, right? Who might be like teaching, you know, not tokenizing students, but also appreciating their specialness. So those are contradictory things. And I wonder where does the fighting of the racism come in? You know, and I think we were just talking today at lunch, and he's like, well, you're talking about your class this semester, and I haven't for a while because it's been like such a battle. And so, you know, my class professor let me push them, which is a wonderful reward, but normally, you know, it's a shit show. So, like, where does the teaching fighting racism, where does that happen?
Well, I think, so one of the, well, two things I'm thinking about. I mean, one of the things, sort of this early piece where students mentioned the importance of setting norms, I mean, I think there's a really key piece around just learning is going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. You know, there's a difference between being safe and being comfortable, right? And I think we have to talk about that and make that distinction. And it's okay to be in that liminal space, right? It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to sit with stuff. So I think that's having that, having that conversation and setting that as a foundation for the work starting out, I mean, allows for a challenging and a pushing. And, you know, if you already knew all this, if you already have it, then why are we here, right? Why are we having this conversation? I think that the other piece, though, as instructors is about, well, one, I'll say two things. I mean, one is you're never going to get everybody in the room to where you want them. And so a lot of times what we do is we spend a lot of time on the one or two that are very resistant, whereas 80% are ready to move with the conversation. And I would suggest that we reverse that, right? Because it gets us, we get stuck there. And then the other piece is that we start to also think more long term. And so it might not be in the 10 weeks, it might not be in the 16 weeks that we are able to move students to the place that we feel they should be or that we would like to move them. But maybe it's 2 years later, right, when something happens. And now I get it, you know, what that conversation was about. So sort of thinking about it in the long term also. Yeah.
Coming from a student's perspective, and I'm sure everybody's been students at one point, and we're all still students of life because, you know, life doesn't end until we die. But it's that, and my professor currently, Amy Brenzel, who's teaching gender studies, the way that they have approached the subject of gender studies, and it's not just gender studies as in the heteropatriarchal, male, female and stuff, it's humanistic studies, as in everything, and a lot of the course material is very conflicting with people's norms and with societal norms and with values and such. But I feel like as professors, if you guys start to worry about, who's in the classroom and maybe I don't want to say this thing because I might step on somebody's toes, then you'll take away from really the value of spreading your knowledge from wherever you come from and such. Amy, like I said, has done a very great job of keeping everything neutral, but then I have professors I'm not going to list the name, the first day that I come in, they call me Jungle Boy. As I go up to write something on stage, I was wearing this exact shirt and my hair was a little frizzy. I mean, it is what it is. They call me Jungle Boy, but the thing is, they teach math, and it's not. I don't take it as in something that it's whoa, I'm now Jungle Boy and I'm ostracized. It's, what, I'm here and I'm paying for the class, so I better learn the course material, no matter what. That's what it is. I've been in college since I was 15. I've been outcast because of my age, race, whatever I may come off as, and it doesn't take away. If you're in college to get a degree and to get out of it whatever you want out of it, it's the pursuit of knowledge. So as professors, just give your knowledge, and know what? The students will take from it what they want. If their toes get stepped on, then maybe when they're professors, they can shift it or change it or something.
You're looking at a response.
Yes, actually, to that comment and others, I want to remind students on Monday, April 25th, in the sub from 12 to 3, we're having a large forum where students can talk about what a hostile campus and climate this is. And we have some faculty and students and community to come to the podium and talk about these issues. Secondly, I want to say that I'm a member of the Institute for Civic Race and Social Justice, and I was one of the designers for this program. And the statement that Dr. Osi Kofi and Shah Jahan and Pat have reported is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to change their minds and their consciousness so that, for example, rather than when we say we use the word race, we always put it in quotation marks to show that it is a political social construct. But we are really trying to get you to move to the process of using the term racialization, which Dr. Kosio mentioned also too. To understand that this is a process, it's an ongoing process, and how do we help you colonize minds and sometimes helping other professors to find the opportunity to become disobedient with their epistemologies and break free from that as well. So give some of us some time, but we're getting there. We're getting there. So, and students like yourselves who inform other students through the process also help us with this work as well. But I just want to add that.
Thank you very much. Yes, in the back and then I'll come here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Emma. I do have, excuse me for coming a little late. My first question is, was the video in a high school or was it at a university?
It's a university. University, yes.
Okay, my second question is, what I find interesting is that we want to bring in these conversations in higher education institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But why are we focusing on also in high schools and public K-12 education institutions? The reason why I'm asking
Why are we or why are we not? I'm sorry.
Why are we not?
Okay.
Having these conversations with our younger generations, specifically in high schools, I feel that at that age, that's when they're adolescents. So they're trying to find that identity. They're trying to understand maybe why their groups are being marginalized and being pressed down for being a certain gender, for being a certain class, and for being a certain race, ethnicity. I know that where I grew up in, there was a lot of oppression towards me because I was female and Mexican American. My own advisor told me that you're not good enough for college.
Right.
Specifically for those reasons, being female and being a certain ethnicity. And that I found very confusing. When I started college, my junior year, I took a class with Nancy Lopez, and she went over race and cultural relations, and the first thing that came to my head is that why aren't we having these discussions with high school students? And I want to know your thought on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are places where that is certainly happening, but I don't think there's enough of it. So I mean, I think you make a good point in terms of that. I mean, another way to think about it is, where to enter the conversation or where to begin to work for change. And I think that there are multiple entry points, and folks decide sort of where they enter into the conversation. So, this institution prepares teachers, right? So sometimes. So, so what, what is it about teacher education and the ways that in which we prepare teachers that creates a situation where students come to college and don't have these concepts, right? Don't have these ideas. And so I think there are multiple entry points, right, in terms of doing that work. But absolutely, I think we need it all throughout education. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us your knowledge. Just real quick, I wanted to talk to your concern. There's a group called Families United for Education, and Mr. Tony Watkins is here, and we're trying to start ethnic studies in APS on Albuquerque Public Schools. So we're always looking for people to join us. Speaking as I'm currently an instructor in the College of Ed, it's very hard to educate teachers. The course that I teach deals a lot with issues of privilege and oppression and structural systems that produce that contribute to this oppression. And as a woman of color, it's very hard to teach about these topics to students who may feel like, well, why you're saying this because you're biased, because I'm white and you hate us, and that's why you're teaching about this. And sometimes it's very hard to have these conversations. I still talk on and I still do it with my students because I think that feeling of being uncomfortable is going to help them grow. In the meantime, though, it's very isolating to teach and being a person of color and talk about these issues with students who may not, especially because always in the back of your mind, like I'm a graduate student and I'm always thinking about course evaluation. I'm going to be asked again next year. If I get a very crappy evaluation, I may not be asked again because I made a huge part of my class upset and uncomfortable. And I think that sometimes that works also. It doesn't bother me because I figure, you know what? I mean, I'm not a tenure or senior tenure, I'm still a graduate student. But it can be very lonely. It can be very lonely. And I don't know what advice you had for, because I was in a course that I think you talked about in your thing, and it was a class that talked about these issues, and we had a couple of students who were very uncomfortable, and the class was totally shut down. And the rest of the semester, we never discussed the readings the rest of the semester. The instructor opted to do videos instead of addressing how uncomfortable those students were. So the rest of us in the class, paying for graduate credits, were deprived from learning from this professor because I don't know if she was scared or what was the issue. And those issues were never discussed. So I don't know your thoughts about that a little bit more.
Yes, many questions.
No, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. I mean, I think yes on the ways in which, the sort of, it's this idea of embodied text, right? The ways in which we are read and what happens with that. And so, and the burnout that comes with that, the emotional work that is involved in that. And so finding community as a way of working with that is absolutely, I think, critical. It's, so that's one piece around that. You talked about student evaluations, right, and the ways in which that a lot of times might shape what we feel like we're able to do and not do. And despite so this is, one of these places where there is a gap between research and practice, right? Because, we know what course evaluations measure and what they don't measure, right? And we know that, they measure, basically, I can show a picture of you and the results, right? And your teaching evaluation will be the same as at the end of your 10 or 16 weeks, right? 2 or 3 minute. The data is there, right? It's yes. So I think with that is, there are lots of ways in which those within the institution, so I'm talking now about sort of tenure, full professors, senior folks, we have a responsibility to do the work of changing the ways in which evaluations are used, for example, what they mean, the ways that teaching is evaluated, period, right? To open up that space for the type of work so that you're not in that space of being fearful for what they're going to say. And I actually have a colleague that talks about it when we teach difficult subject matter such as this, that the discomfort And the sometimes low teaching evaluations are actually a sign of learning, right? Because of what that, the cognitive dissonance, I guess, that comes with that as well. So it's, yeah, so that, I mean, I think there are multiple pieces to that. And the piece that you talked about with the class that was, sort of didn't go anywhere or it shut down at that piece, I mean, I think that there is a, I don't know what happened at the beginning of that class, but there really is a big piece around the time that's used early on to work with how we're going to interact with one another, what it means to be a community of learners, how we're going to deal with tension when it comes up, right? What is our process for that? What is our mechanism for that? And one of the challenges there is that most of us teach the way that we're taught, right? So as faculty, most faculty have no formal training, education, background in teaching, right, in pedagogy. And so that, I think, contributes to some of what you spoke of. Yeah.
So actually, I teach a middle school teacher in a school that's pretty open about like gender. So it's like I maybe have a transgender in each of my classes. So it's really open in that sense. But in terms of race, it's always kind of I don't know. It's not a topic that we talk too much about in this whole school. But and when I took a class for my licensure, my professor was really brought it up at the first class, and she made us open up about our background, individual background. You know, so I'm from Quebec, so you know, French Canadian, and everybody was talking about it, and I thought that, but it was part of an assignment. But and then another thing I want to mention is that students at that age are really sensitive to black and white, or we're gonna black pencil, white paper, and, you know, and they make joke about that. And it's really, and they bring something up, and they're really sensitive to the word, but they take it really literally, and they might not take into consideration, you know, another person in the class, or you know, the context of this conversation that maybe they heard. And so I don't know. It's always it's still pretty difficult for me to talk about it. For I don't know. Do you have any tips or?
Well, I don't know if I have tips. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about what you mentioned is that there are some who would argue that as nations, if you will, we have the hardest time talking about that which we feel the greatest shame, right? And so that is one of the ways in which there are lots of ways in which it's difficult for a lot of people to talk about race, right, and to talk about racism in this culture, to name that and to engage that.
Yeah, even as a French Canadian, I'm like a white minority. You know, like I you know, in terms of feeling, you know, like a Native American. I mean, not really, but there's still the minority among Canada that's from the minority
right.
in America that speaks French, but they're like trying to like put them.
Well, and I think like that's an important piece, right? Where one, like history matters, and also having a sense of sort of making a distinction between, right, structural forces that shape the conditions under which people live. And so I'm thinking with your students and the difference between that and you know, maybe in one class at one particular time being the only one, if you will, right? So really, I mean, helping students with those analytical tools to understand those differences and to see those distinctions as well. So the way that you know, the way that it's about more than individuals, and the way that it shapes the material conditions of the day-to-day, everyday lives of certain populations. Yeah.
There's a great board game that really helps with young people on that. It's called The Last Straw, and it's actually from Canada. And you roll through your identity around race, gender, sexual orientation, and class. And then you move through life, and you're differentially impacted based on your identity, based on structural racism, structural sexism in the society, and your own choices. But it really illuminates how we don't have a level playing field across those intersections. So that's a really good board game to play.
And then I had a question for you too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and for the presentation. Inspiring and insightful. I learned a lot. I'm wondering, so I'm part of Family Center for Education, and we have an audience of the Chief Academic Officer in our K-12 system, Katrina Sandoval, on May 6th.
Okay.
So we want to make the most out of that meeting. So she's going to get actually she's a new hire, a woman of color. She's an ally. She's a woman of color in a hugely white, conservative department of a predominantly white school district that serves predominantly people of color, families of color. So she's become a good gatekeeper. She's opened the door for us to have this space with directors of curriculum and department heads, all that kind of stuff, in curriculum group are going to be predominantly white and very conservative. So we're advocating for ethnic studies K through 12. Naritza has put together a beautiful one-page document on what we want for learning outcomes that speaks to intersection. And I go back to your talk about how the institution wants to check off boxes, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want, we don't want to be another box that's checked off. We want to have substantive change. And I'm appreciating your distinction between attitudinal changes and material and structural changes. So we're going to have an audience of people. We want their attitudes to change because they've been bad gatekeepers and closed-minded, considering themselves the experts, whereas the community is the experts. And we're afraid they're going to check off the box by saying, okay, we met with you. What would be a good outcome of that meeting that would actually drive us towards material and structural change? Like, what would be an ask or a demand in that context?
Well, I probably don't know enough about sort of the specifics, right, to answer that adequately. But so this is the first meeting that you're having with this group, or?
First with the group. We have a couple with her individually, but never with her staff. And so we're going to plan the meeting with her, because she's an ally, and then we're going to have the meeting. So we want to tell some stories around real lived experiences of oppression and struggle and resistance from people. And then we're going to have small group meetings with their staff. But boy, I mean, we've been at this, Vernon and I have been at this for a long time with this institution, starting with challenging a textbook, a racist textbook. It was like 10 years ago. I find a textbook of my daughter, find a textbook. So now here it is 10 years later, and we have this opportunity, and we really want to make the most out of it. So I just thought I had this opportunity to just get your gut feel on that. That's what
Well, I don't know if you're not using it. I mean, I would certainly use the data that shows, right, student learning and the ways in which ethnic studies in high schools increases student learning and student test scores and things like that. I mean, a lot of that has come out of Arizona with the struggles that Arizona has had around those issues. So I think that might be a piece if that's not part of your plan at this point. I mean, strategically, and this is, I guess strategically, I would say, I mean, you have to decide what your outcome is and what it is that you want, but focusing on one thing that you feel that you can accomplish. I feel like a lot of times what happens, so I think a lot about institutions of higher education, but, so we do campus climate surveys and they're like strategic planning around diversity and equity and like 32 things that we're going to do around this. And then none of it happens, or the act of just doing the survey is a way in which we talk about, well, we've done something, we did the survey. And so I've talked about before, I know where, if you took those campus climate surveys off the shelf and dusted them off and just took like one thing and made that happen, it would get us much further than, oh, we need to do another campus climate survey because it's been 5 years. Oh, it's been another 5 years. So I mean, maybe there's something there in terms of thinking strategically around that. And I guess last piece is just, you talked about those group meetings, and I think that the way, strategically, the way that we do some of this work around change is those influencer dialogues or individual conversations one-on-one with people, so that, some people talk about this idea that when you come to the group, you already want to know what the outcome is going to be, right? You've already done the work that will give you that decision when you come together as a whole. So I think that pre-work is really, really key. Yeah, there and then there.
So in your lecture, you mentioned human desire to be recognized as the host, as opposed to the encroaching other. So would you say that comes as a result of failure to identify with the structure? Because what I sense in class is that students have a tendency to discuss the structure as though they weren't a part of it. Yeah, we tend to discuss the structure as us against the structure, when in reality we are a part of the structure.
Right. Oh yeah. All
Would you
implicated.
speak to identifying with the structure as opposed to disassociating yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we're all implicated. I mean, that's, we're implicated differently, but certainly we're all implicated. So I think, I mean, I think I'm agreeing with your point around that. Part of what I was trying to get at with the host-guest sort of analogy also is this idea that a lot of our language, I would say, in education about diversifying and sort of increasing representation and access is framed in a guest host, it has a guest host frame. So, you know, we want to be welcoming. Well, so who's welcoming whom, right? Those types of pieces. So that was sort of what I was trying. So there's a way in which, to some people, it's always home, right? Or it's a place of belonging, and to others, it's not in those same ways. But I mean, I think to your main point, I just would agree with you in that. And so I think it's about, you're making me think of, D'Angelo, I can't think of her first name, but Robin DiAngelo, one of the things that she talks about around this work is when people talk in the ways that you're describing, where it's as though they're outside of it, coming back and always asking, so what does that mean to your life? Or how are you implementing that in your own life? Or how have you seen that in your own day-to-day environment, right? So keep coming back to that as a way of pushing people to internalize.
Another awesome point I thought you made was the point of becoming more comfortable with the idea of a lack of an answer.
Yeah.
Becoming more comfortable with the question itself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I guess I appreciate everything that you talk about, and I think this is great. And I think as a tenured faculty member, I don't think my fight is with the students. My fight has been with other faculty members who probably should be hired as soon as possible. So I think two things I would like to kind of like ask you, given that you're the director of the race and stuff like that. So two things is, so one thing is, how do I talk to those tenured faculty to understand what we do? And the other thing is, they always use a coded word, something like, oh, these people are critical scholars, they're so angry, but they're actually saying, oh, we don't want to hear about race, we don't want to hear about sexuality, and all of those things, right? So how do we engage in those communications? Because those are people in position of power who can actually help us to do more of these kind of work.